Sit. Hey there everyone, my name's Nick, this is Walter, and this is the new workbench. You know, the one you clicked on the video for. It's got 4 casters that can be engaged and disengaged, 4 good-sized drawers, a shelf so you don't clutter your workbench with tools while you're working on something, quick release vise, and a big enough working area to fit your hunting dog and a cup of coffee. Here's the timestamps for different parts of the video if you want to jump around. Wait. There you go. And you can find a link down in the description if you want to read about why I made some of the decisions I did with this workbench, why I picked the features that I did, and also a set of plans. They're only $5, so Walter wants you to go check those out too. Without further ado, let's get into the build. The first thing I did was break down 2 3/4-inch sheets of plywood for the cabinet components. I originally planned on cutting them to rough size with the track saw and then making the final cuts with the table saw, but I found I was getting accurate enough cuts with the track saw alone, so I skipped the last step. With the exception of the side and back pieces, I cut the heights for those 3 pieces on the table saw to ensure that they were all the same height. Once I had those 3 components dry fit, I took measurements directly off of it to cut 4 stretchers to go across to eliminate any racking, as well as give me a place to screw the top down to when it came time. Then set up a stop block on my bandsaw so that I could cut a 3" by 3" square out of the sides for a toe kick. Doing a test on a piece of OSB first, and when I was happy with that, I did it on the actual sides. I also forgot to cut the actual toe kick until much later in the build, but now would be a good time for that. I used a 1/2" thick piece of aspen for this, the same one that I used for edge banding later on. Time for a bunch of pocket holes to screw everything together. I used glue and pin nails to hold the pieces together. This way turned out a lot easier than clamping everything. And this is what it looks like with the 3 sides and 4 stretchers assembled. Next is time to make a bunch of drawers. There's a ton of drawer build and installation videos all over YouTube, so I'm not going to get too into it. But I used the leftover 3/4-inch plywood pieces for the drawer bottoms and scrap 1/2" plywood for the drawer sides. And this crosscut sled with a stop block made for a quick and repeatable work of this. I used just glue and screws to assemble them, and originally I thought that it might be too flimsy, but was pleasantly surprised with how sturdy they are assembled and dried. All of the bases are about 24 inches by 30 inches, making them good sized drawers, and I'm pretty happy with how they turned out. With the drawers built, I cut edge banding out of that same 1/2" aspen board to put on the plywood face on the front of the cabinet. I just used glue and painter's tape to assemble it as opposed to using nails too. It worked well because I didn't have any holes to fill. I sanded the little bit of glue squeeze out after everything was dry and I took the tape off. And then I could install the drawer slides and get the drawers mounted in the cabinet. I used these 24-inch ball bearing full extension drawer slides. They were about $17 a piece, but well worth it for how nice they slide. And I think they're also rated for 100 pounds each. I installed the first set flush on the bottom stretchers because I know they're level with the bottom, and then used a 1/2" shim to lift the box itself higher than the stretchers. A self-centering drill bit made it easy to get a good pilot hole, and then it's just a matter of putting screws in. Worked my way up the whole thing until I had a cabinet with 4 drawers. With the drawers in place, I began working on the drawer fronts. I broke down an oversized 3/4-inch board of aspen with the circular saw before taking it to the table saw for consistent crosscuts. I ripped the widths as I went to get a nice reveal for what I was looking for. I didn't overthink this part and just went with what I thought looked good. Taking the drawers out and doing the faces one by one allowed me to shoot 2 nails into the back of each when I was happy with how they aligned up. Once I had them all in place, I came back with some panhead screws to really fasten them in from the inside. The last part of this cabinet construction was building and attaching the top. I sized it so that the sides and back were flush with the cabinet, and the front had enough overhang to be a little bit over the drawer faces, taking into account that there would be 1/2" hardwood banding all the way around this top piece. With that all set, I clamped it in place and used the same panhead screws to attach it through the top stretchers. I also put a 45-degree chamfer on the drawer faces to make those edges just a little bit stronger. Then it was time for sanding. more sanding, even more sanding, and you guessed it, more sanding. By far my least favorite part. I worked through 80, 120, and 220 grit on the carcass and drawer faces, and then attempted to vacuum off any fine dust. I used 2 coats of this Minwax honey stain with a semi-transparent gloss, applying 2 coats with a rag and following the instructions for wait time. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Now on to the legs. I used 4x4s to make the legs, but you could use a number of different things, including laminating 2x4s or plywood. The important thing is that you end up with true 3" by 3" stock, and I think that this is both a sturdy dimension and it looks pretty good. You'll end up with 4 legs and 4 cross pieces. For the exact dimensions of everything, check out the plans in the description where I've got everything laid out, cut sheets, diagrams, step by step, anything you need. I took a moment to lay out the pieces to be as visually appealing as possible, but realistically, a lot of that individual grain or character was hidden by the dark stain anyways. And after that, I did some joinery layout to make sure that I drilled and cut things in the right place. This is only my second time doing any real mortise and tenon joinery. I used the table saw to cross-cut the tendons and then the bandsaw to rip cut the waist off. It ended up working pretty well, and I only had to clean up the shoulders a little bit with the chisel. As for the mortises, I used a Forstner bit to drill away the majority of the waist, and then a chisel to clean away the rest. Some of them turned out pretty good, and some of them, well, they looked like dog shit. But the important part is that the shoulders look clean, and that's all you're going to see at the end anyways. Then I drilled some holes to accept 1/4 inch dowels to peg the joinery together, dry fit each side, and cut the 1/4 inch dowels to length. My aha moment, as obvious as it may seem during this, is that when you have a peg joint like this, you really don't need clamps to hold anything together. This might be a good approach for somebody who doesn't have parallel clamps, whether they're just too big and cumbersome or not in the picture financially. It ended up working out really well, and I would say was even less stressful than a normal glue up. Once the glue dried, I trimmed the overhang and it was time to sand and stain. I finished the legs the exact same way that I finished the carcass because I wanted this whole base unit to have one cohesive look to it. Screwed the cabinet to the legs from the inside, attached these casters that I stole from my old mobile tool base, link in the description of that video, and put a couple coats of poly on. I then used this little jig that I got off Amazon. They're pretty cheap and there's a million different vendors, but I'll have a link in the description for it. Did a test piece for the drawer pulls and then attached those, and with that it was time to move on to the top. I'm really happy with the construction of my old bench top. It was just 2x4s with a bowl nose cut off, laminated on edge, and then connected to a frame. But with this being the only real horizontal surface in my new shop, I wanted more surface if at all possible. So I'm cutting down more pieces and just making the bench top deeper, laminating the main part up, and then running it through the planer to get the right depth. I also made this little tool holder slot by cutting 2 chunks out of the last board prior to gluing up, then a dry fit, marking for biscuits, cutting the biscuits, and finally glue up. I'm using this big Eclipse vise because if it's good enough for Paul Sellers, it's good enough for me. After deciding I wanted it all the way to the right side because I'm a lefty, I flipped the workbench over, added a spacer to get the height right, pre-drilled, and then drove through some 1/4 inch lag bolts. I don't know why more people don't do this, but I inset the back vice jaw into the last board of the bench top. This way you can clamp something along the entire front face of the workbench top and legs. I connected the last board with more lag bolts in case it ever needs to be replaced or I need to get to the vise for some reason, and flushed it up with the rest of a bench top with a plane. For the other jaw, I used a nice piece of Doug fir, I think, that I had laying around. Then I marked square sides to the front, cut on that line with a track saw, and then finished the cut with my handsaw. Just a little cleanup with the belt sander, and I'm pretty happy with it. I extended the dog holes down my workbench and in line with my new vise, using this drill guide to get pretty perpendicular holes. Pre-drill holes through the underside of the leg stretchers and lag bolt the top down to the legs from the underside. And just like that, we've got a workbench. I'm really happy with it so far. I haven't been using it for too long, but the added work surface is already very much appreciated. And I think it's going to be time to organize some tools in these drawers pretty soon. I want to thank you guys for watching this far. And again, reminder, if you're interested in building this for yourself, there's plans down in the description. And there's an article about why I made the decisions I did on this workbench. With that, have fun building. Come on.